any person like doing, that's it from there on you.
Yeah, my staff car is still that one, and it's about 4 years out of date. But it's still get things going.
You're looking good on it,
Less hairy.
And it was overnight, but because we had to drive through Germany and then to Denmark, they were border patrol. They brought dogs on it. Show me your passport. Yeah. As a kid, they got it.
There's a button on it, right? There's a button.
Real.
You press the button, it might say okay. Okay, so we're at 4:30. I'm guessing we might have a few more. We might not have a few more. I have no vested interest in how many people turn on, but I'm glad to see a few people. And I guess today this is the first time I've done this presentation for this group. So for the Applied Psychology Club, which sounds fun, and I'm very the artist to present. And my hope is to give you a bit of a sense of what counselling psychology is, and to kind of go through some of the similar material that I guess you've had in other sessions. So thinking about kind of giving you a sense of who I am, why I'm talking at you, hopefully with you about counselling psychology. Getting a sense of what your questions will be, so I gather you've all kind of used Menti in previous sessions, so kind of trying to get you kind of into that sort of territory, just to hear kind of what your interests are, and I'm interested in answering your questions, rather than just talking at you, I suppose. Then thinking about how you might get into a career into counselling psychology, because obviously I would inspire you all to want to go down that pathway. The one with no money. But there are jobs at the end of it, which I know is kind of a key interest down here. So thinking about the experiences you might have, the roles you might take on, the training that you might do, and then some links that you might sort of take from it as well. So I don't know if people, do people normally just scan this?
Yes, yeah. Because some people here may have been to the other sessions about clinical psychology and educational psychology and our introductory sessions, or they may not. But it doesn't matter, you're very welcome.
You are.
So people may have been through this process in relation to applied psychology before or not.
Cool. So on here, this should take you to the kind of the Menti page anyway. And I've embedded kind of one of the ones so that we can see the answers to the burning questions up on the screen shortly. The rest of it, kind of, I think you can fill in your own time and kind of work your way through. And whilst you're kind of looking at that, I thought, well, maybe that'd be the opportunity for me to talk about who I am, kind of why I'm talking at you, what my experience has been kind of in terms of getting into counselling psychology, and why I still quite like it. This morning I was saying to Catherine, I spent the morning talking to the College of Sexual and Relationship Therapists, sort of about the interface between AI and therapy. And so I already feel a bit frazzled at talking to people, so if you kind of have questions, feel free to chip in as well. So, who am I? I thought I'd go back. So what got me into this? Because if I'm honest, I detested my psychology degree. I had very little interest in it whatsoever. And there was a lot of, I had to get up on Thursday morning for a stats lab class. I don't know why they did that. It did not really sit very well with me. And then it got to year 3, and they asked me, they had a more applied element. So within that element, we did a sort of a counselling skills unit, and it was kind of more there was an element of qualitative research as well. And there was something different about it, and I found it quite engaging. So we were working in much smaller groups, we were doing more applied work, people were talking about real people in real world situations. And I don't know, it seemed different to a lot of the content that we'd had before. So when I come out of my degree, which was a dual honours, so it was a psychology and history degree, with medieval history. I know a lot about Welsh castles. But I thought I might be able to use in some shape or form. In reality, I've done nothing with that other than my holidays. And I wanted to stay at university. So I quite like this degree, the end of the degree, and I thought, well, maybe if I can stay at university, that'd be a good idea. So I've become a full-time carer for a student at a university and got involved in kind of supporting him both in terms of physical needs, academic needs, and it was 24-hour care. It was pretty intense. I learned a lot about myself, and a lot about myself in relation to others, in relation to disability, in relation to kind of, thinking about, well, what are my values in the world, what do I want this place to look like? At the same time, I was sort of doing some youth work. So I was doing detached youth work, because it all sort of fit together in the sense of, well, okay, if I can't get into medieval castles and archaeology, it's pretty competitive, maybe I need to find another sort of avenue. So I wandered around the streets of Staffordshire, providing condoms and sexual health information, barbecues. I don't know why it was those 2 things, but it was kind of all these different bits. Sometimes it mixed in a weird way. But then, and it was all about kind of working with people in the kind of real world context. And at the same time, I thought I would continue my sort of training to become a therapist. So I did a certificate in counselling skills piece of work, which is a 1-year part-time course at Keele University. And with that, at that point in time, I had to have a placement. So I was actually working within schools as a therapist and kind of supporting young people within that sort of educational context. So it sort of started to make sense to me. At that point in time, I had no idea really where I wanted this sort to go. So then they employed me at this counselling service, and I continued my studies. So I did a master's in counselling at the University of Manchester, so just across the road over here. Whilst I was sort of working in these schools and community settings. So we were doing essentially work that was fitting between education and CAMS services. So there were lots of people falling through the gaps. CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, wasn't really fitting the needs of those individuals, for whatever reason that was. And so we were doing much more creative interventions. We do things like Pokemon sweatshops, so people would come in and just talk about Pokemon cards. We've made big papier-mâché figures and sort of stick mental health sort of issues. It was purposefully trying to be creative and engaging. And I did that for about a decade. And then I got swept into academia, which I'll talk about in a moment. And whilst I've been at the university, I've been working with, as a volunteer in an organisation called Freedom from Torture, which again is in central Manchester, that had a partnership with FC United. And I did some work with these sort of individuals who were kind of from all sorts of countries, war-torn, kind of running away, sort of seeking asylum within the UK, and providing a football therapy program. So what that involved, I guess, this links to a chapter that I wrote about that work, will mainly involve people kicking the football very hard at me while I was in bed. That was a lot of it. There was a lot more to it than that. And I guess lots of those men are in very vulnerable positions, and if you think about things like changing rooms, where maybe you're sort of in incredibly vulnerable positions, and trying to protect that space, that became part of my role. And the common thread through lots of these things was I was interested in access. How do people access therapy services? I think we build up walls you know, often it's incredibly hard. You look at the waiting list of CAMs, they're astronomically high. You almost have to be, I won't say things, but you have to be incredibly distressed to kind of get through when it comes to waiting lists these days. And lots of my work has been about sort of thinking about more creative avenues of trying to access, support people in accessing therapy, whether that's through football, whether that's through different activities. And a big part of my work in academia and at the university has been, where is it? It's the next one. No? I didn't put it on here. It's about looking at the interface, there it is, the interface between technology and therapy. So, just a quick show. Has anyone heard of Coot? one over there, one there. No? Okay, so Coot is an online counselling and support service that was developed in Manchester. And lots of my research was with them. So it's a bit like Childline, so people know the telephone support line. It was anonymous, people could text in and get support either over a sustained period of time or for a one-off support. So lots of my research has been with them, considering how maybe they can make their services more accessible. More recently, we've been looking at things like, you know, can they use AI algorithms in the background of their website with a view of kind of trying to identify things like risk. So the young person is completing maybe a journal, and they say, you know, I'm going to cut myself really badly today, then an algorithm can pick that up and refer it to a human to follow that up. And the idea of that is that in a service that gets 100,000 of these a week, then maybe that can concentrate the human time rather than reviewing 100,000 posts. You can actually limit it down to 1,000 posts where maybe you can kind of provide more intensive support for those people who are in need. So that's kind of my interest, is that sort of, well, how do you make these accessible? How do we kind of work in a system that is flooded with need, you know, in the sense that, you know, it's common statistics that, you know, 1 in 5 people within a typical classroom will have some sort of mental health difficulty. You know, it's a lot of people. There's a lot of distress, there's a lot of misery, there's a lot of upset within the world, and so maybe there are different ways that we can kind of support people. Also, I think that if we take a one-size-fits-all approach, then typically it's not going to work for us. And I think that one of my challenges to a lot of the kind of medicalisation of psychology is that it sort of takes that approach of sort of saying, well, okay, you're depressed, you're anxious, you have eating disorders, and therefore then says, this is the way that you respond to that. And there are always a multitude of ways that you can hopefully respond from an individual. So, I guess that's where I am. I'm training, sort of, the reason why I was asked to do this presentation is I set up the doctorate in counselling and psychology at the university about, what are we now, 2024? I think it took the first intake in 2009. It's been a while, 15 years of kind of intake in terms of that. So we were the first counselling psychology doctorate in the northwest of England. There were only 13 of them across the UK. And we're the only one that's in the Russell Group University, which is sort of quite research intensive. So that was an interesting process, and I've sort of stayed linked to that programme and teach on that programme still. As I say, I sort of do research into the interface between technology and therapy. I've written some books. This is a massive edited text around sort of the sage handbook of counselling and psychotherapy, which is sort of like an overview of different therapeutic approaches. Book that's just about this key topics in counselling psychology. Was commissioned by the British Psychological Society as a kind of an introductory text to this. So some of the things I talk to come from that book. Introducing counselling and psychotherapy research, not a very popular book. Adolescent counselling psychology, reasonably popular. You can always tell, like, you get pittance of commission. You spend hours and hours writing these things, and I would say, this one I'd probably get £500 a year from. This one I'd probably get £2.50 a year from. If you want to go into academia, it's not going to pay the it's not going to pay the bills. Well, the salaries pay the bills, but all these other things don't, just to give you a sense of that. And this is sold a lot. It's sold sort of thousands of copies, but these trickling sort of yearly. And sometimes this is a sort of a link to a blog. I just write little rambles about kind of where therapy interfaces with maybe everyday life, and just spash them into the world for some reason, because we're supposed to kind of do things like this as academics. I quite like it because it's quite therapeutic to sort of sit there and write a few hundred words about the interface between therapy and football, or what's the difference between clinical psychology and counselling psychology, of which you can see my views on that. But now, is there anything before I get to the questions that you might have from today's session? Does anyone want to ask anything about me, what I've just said?
With the football therapy stuff, how did you come up with that idea, or was that how did you get into it?
Well, it was an idea that came from the organisation's service users. So what they were noticing was that lots of the men were very apprehensive to get into therapy. So imagine therapy is quite an intense activity, sitting one-to-one in a room with chairs, usually with a translator. Lots of the men have come from countries where therapy as we know it they don't really understand that sort of context. In some ways, some of the men talked about elders within their villages and things like that sort of more fit the brief of kind of what they were doing. So what the service user group that leads and is involved in the management of that service did was they sort of asked, well, what can we do to help people at least become familiar with the service and feel safe within that service, so then they might want to sort of go into these other more intense activities. And one of the things they said was maybe we could set a football program. So we looked around the different sort of football teams around. FC United were welcome, very welcome. We actually had a link with Manchester United for a while. I don't think the photographs were what they wanted. They wanted younger people who were kind of, and I think that they eventually cut ties with that, whereas FC United were always very receptive, and they provided coaching for the men. We provided food for the men, and it was kind of more of a social intervention into that. So it kind of grew through that kind of.
Yeah.
I suppose the other thing I didn't mention on this list, and it sort of links to the counselling psychology philosophy in some ways. And so I worked after that football therapy project sort of ended, which sort of got flattened by COVID. I couldn't do any group work at that point in time, and it was such a challenge getting back up and running. That I did some supervisory work for an organisation called the Berry Involvement Group, which is a service user-led organisation. So I provide some supervisory support to them. And I suppose lots of counselling psychologists value this idea of being quite grounded and bottom up, of asking people, well, what services mental health for you, rather than saying everyone's depressed, let's do CBT, which seems to be the usual one. Come in. Any other questions, thoughts?
Were they actually playing football, not just talking about it?
Yeah.
Training up to that level.
Yeah, so, we played competitively.
Good stuff.
We were talking, this is one of the weirder things, so Catherine and I were talking, so we played competitively, and I actually got an injury in a match with the Glasgow football team, and ended up 10 days in an IV trip in the hospital just because of
Wasn't in your job description.
It wasn't, and I remember signing off doctorates while in bed, which was a bit weird. But yeah, it was a little bit odd. But we played football, but we got the bus. So if you imagine these men didn't necessarily sort of know how to use the public transport systems, and we did things like that. We took food with us. We played football. We had a coaching session, and then be a little bit of a debrief as a group, and that Mary below you. It's an interesting thing, but that does talk a bit about it if people are interested. Any other questions or thoughts? Wonder if I leave the space, maybe we'll lose more people as we go. Okay, let's see what questions you've got. So, what are the links to clinical and cancer psychology? I knew you'd ask this one. I'll come to that one. What different types of clinical psychologists are there, and what are the routes to bricking a counsellor? What does that mean? I don't have a go at answering it. It sounds pretty brutal. Potential uni, career pathways, experience opportunities, I've talked to that a bit. If I want to take a year gap after my third year, what do you recommend me to do during this gap year? What kind of experience? Okay, again, we'll probably talk to that idea of kind of what experiences might be helpful to get onto a cancer psychology doctorate. Things that I need if I want to become a qualified cancer psychologist in the UK, yeah, we'll talk to that. And is it a good idea for me to get into cancer psychology if I've struggled with my own mental health before and still trying to do? Okay, so an important question. That one I'm not going to talk to specifically, but I'll answer it now in the sense of I don't think kind of mental health difficulties should exclude people from being mental health professionals by any stretch of the imagination. I think in some ways having difficulties, we often talk about the idea of being experts by experience. And I think people's personal experiences and sensitivities to a particular topic can actually be a strength within certain contexts. The caveat within that is doing it in a scaffolded way. So if you're working in an area where maybe you're still potentially having difficulties, and if that has a resonance with you that is unhelpful, that it keeps you kind of in a difficult position, then obviously we wouldn't encourage people to do that. Doesn't mean that you couldn't work in another context. Well, for an example, I suppose it's a difficult example to explain. I decided to back away from some of my own therapeutic work when I remember I had young children, and I was working with children of an older age, but I knew there was a much more of a sensitivity in me towards some of the kind of words that those young people were saying, and at that point in time I felt I had wanted to back away from certain bits of my work, my therapeutic work, because I didn't think it was really good for my own mental health. And I think one of the things that we'd always encourage everyone within sort of working as a cancer psychologist is to be a reflexive practitioner. You have clinical supervision. One of the things we'll talk about in trainings, you'd engage in your own personal therapy. So it's about learning who you are, what pushes your buttons. If you're sitting in a room and someone tells you that they've been sexually abused or kind of, they've suffered some sort of horrific torture, how are you going to respond to them? It's better that you do it in a training context and you don't just regale and go, oh shit, that's really horrible. It's kind of, because that's of no help to anyone. But being able to sort of, sit there and listen and empathise and be with that person while they tell that story, that's a helpful response. And I suppose it's about, in terms of the idea of your own history, is, some of them will be valuable resources for thinking about other people's distress. And in other cases, they might get in the way. It might be a bit of a hurdle to kind of be providing kind of more effective support. There's a bit of a long battle. Any reflections on that? Thoughts? Thank you for raising them. As I say, if we don't come back to them all, then I think most of them will cover. Apart from the bricking bit, I still don't understand.
Being a counsellor, I think, isn't it?
Routes to being a counsellor. What different types of clinical psychologists are there? Okay, we will talk about some of those
You
routes.
won't let anybody brick. Well, not today.
I haven't taken it as a threat. But maybe it will. Okay. So what is a counselling psychologist? So I guess the reason why it's situated here is because it falls under the auspices similar to clinical psychology, similar to educational psychology, forensic psychology. Those protected titles that the Health and Care Professions Council have, counselling psychology is one of them. So weirdly, you can be a counsellor, you can be a psychologist, you can be a psychotherapist, whatever. You know, it's kind of no one legally people won't challenge you. There are voluntary registers that you can kind of be on. They haven't changed psychologists, have they? I think you can still be a psychologist on whatever level.
Yeah.
But to be a counselling psychologist, if you use that term, someone could say you're breaking the law in the same way that you're, if you haven't done a specific clinical psychology or educational psychology course. And that's what the Health and Care Professions Council offer. So they offer that kind of protection in that sense. And the British Psychological Society, I guess, are viewed as kind of the learning society. So this is where lots of the educated conversations happen. They have conferences, journals, etc., which I guess we also fall under. We can put chartered psychologists. So I'm a fellow of the British Psychological Society, and I'm a registered HCPC counselling psychologist. Which it's interesting that this sort of club is called the Applied Psychology Club, which is a BPS term. The HCPC uses the term practitioner psychologist, which is also a protected title. So if you were a practitioner psychologist, that might mean that you're clinical, educational, counselling, forensic, occupational,
Health.
All those sort of too restricted. But I thought that kind of, you know, these links, which you can look at in your own time, the DCOP website, that's the Division of Counselling Psychology within the British Psychological Society, which also has sort of a link to kind of a profile of kind of what counselling psychologists might do, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, so I'm not going to go through. And the HCPC link to their standards of proficiency, which is our kind of syllabus or kind of what you need to have to be a counselling psychologist. And it links with all the other applied psychologists, practitioner psychologists, and divides up some specific areas that are just counselling psychology. So, a definition though, I thought I should at least use the definition I come up with, which for this book, so counselling psychology is a strand of the applied psychologies that proactively brings together therapeutic and psychological thinking to inform the support that individuals provide others. So in some ways it's that merging of the two worlds. Within the UK, counselling and psychology during the 1940s divided for some reason. Didn't happen quite the same in the US, but within the UK, a lot of counselling courses were situated within education departments or further education, and they didn't have a link with psychology, which is where we are a little bit now. So if you look at kind of counselling psychology doctorate at Manchester, we're in the Manchester Institute of Education. We're not in the School of Psychology. And part of that is because I guess the School of Psychology is in, I can't remember what it is, FBNH, right, Faculty of Biology and Medical.
Can anybody hear that? What faculty is the undergraduate psychology doing? Faculty of Biomedical Sciences?
It doesn't matter if we
It
don't
doesn't
know.
matter.
It doesn't matter if collectively we don't know.
But it's a bit more medically focused, whereas counselling psychology has always been a little bit more growth focused. So in some ways, the idea of some counselling psychologists will talk about the idea of therapy as being an opportunity to learn about yourself, not necessarily to reduce pathology, which is a slightly different angle. So we talk about it as a kind of a growth focus approach at times. But I carry on. So counselling psychologists make use of theory, practice-based learning, research evidence, personal development activities to make sense and guide the work that they engage in. So most of them will come as no surprise, but I guess the personal development activities is sometimes a little bit more unique to therapy, to counselling training, in the sense that within the activities we ask people to do, we ask you to bring yourself, to learn about yourself. And I think that's part of what really interests me about this as a discipline. Then this work might take place, it's a bit long, I've realised, and I had to divide it up into 2 slides. This work might take place with individuals, groups, communities, and counselling psychologists might adopt a wide variety of overlapping roles, including, and then we have a big list, therapists, clinical supervisors, service managers, trainers, researchers, and activists. And the activist is often in the area, not completely, but I guess that counselling psychologists often sort of take on roles that are more advocacy based or kind of have an interest in social justice, things like that. In all contexts, they recognise the importance of being responsive to the unique situations they encounter, embracing the ambiguity inherent in working with humans, and engaging in rich relationships that promote dialogue and support structured change. One size doesn't fit all, essentially. And I think that sometimes we find that counselling psychologists are there as a challenging voice to services that might sort of adopt a more kind of one-size-fits-all approach. So if you look within NICE guidelines, the hierarchy of evidence often works with a particular view where you have to have randomised controlled trials to demonstrate the efficacy of a particular approach with a particular disorder. Which makes sense when you're commissioning services, but when you meet humans and you sort of say, okay, say you've all got depression, it won't all be the same. It won't all have the same cause. It won't all manifest in the same way. And so the likelihood is, if I adopted exactly the same way of working with all of you, for some of you it would be helpful, for some of you it wouldn't be helpful. And I guess that's what that means in some ways. It's trying to hold on to the idea that when you meet people who are maybe struggling, maybe have difficulties, is that actually you need to meet the person first and then think, well, actually, what might be helpful for this particular individual, rather than just saying, depressed, CBT. Does that make sense? Yes, sorry. Feel free, chip in if you wish. 5 o'clock. That's only half an hour. The values of counselling psychology. I think sometimes people talk about counselling psychology as applied philosophy, which is a bit grand in all honesty. I think we're not very good. Psychologists don't make very good philosophers at times, but I think counselling psychology does try to push people into thinking about what makes us human a bit more at times. Which is where, in terms of the values of counselling psychology, typically we have roots within the growth of humanistic psychology. Does anyone, show of hands, have you come across humanistic psychology before? Okay. Can someone tell me anything about humanistic psychology? Go on.
Like person-centered, like you take into account everything, like holistic almost, like about the person, and then you come up with a therapy or something based off of that.
Yeah, and the term person-centered has its roots within the work of someone like Carl Rogers, who kind of talked about the idea of meeting the individual first and treating everyone as unique. So I would see myself as my practice as being incredibly informed by that sort of humanistic perspective. If we have loads of time, we could do a therapy session. I like doing that. And we could have a play. And then, because I think it's hard to explain kind of what that looks like without actually engaging in it. Did anyone else have any thoughts about humanistic psychology? Anything else that was sort of bubbling around people's heads?
It's based a lot on lived experiences.
Yeah.
And as they were saying before, it kind of has this assumption that people experience things differently.
Yeah, so people are unique. Everyone's experience is really important. You often sort of link it with things like phenomenology. It's kind of one of the areas that's sort of situated as well, philosophically. And trying to understand and get into kind of a person's world, so that lived experience is really important for kind of then starting to think, well, how might I support this person best? Like another way of putting it is we're big hippies, but you know, we try not to sort of just frame it completely in that landscape. Other bits in here are we adopt a pluralistic perspective. So I think that's the idea that there isn't one size fits all. So in our approach at Manchester, we'll talk about kind of introducing people to humanistic approaches, typically person-centered and experiential therapy in year 1, and then in year 2 cognitive behavioural therapy. So two very different worlds in some ways that don't necessarily come together, but really important different types of practice to meet the needs of the different types of people at the moment. Other programs might also introduce things like psychodynamic practices, so thinking about kind of more contemporary versions of what Freud would have done sort of many years ago. So we talk about as well how those things might come together when philosophically they don't match, but actually practically and when you're working with humans in the real world, sometimes it's helpful to make those types of decisions. Then there's often sort of this social justice, an anti-oppressive practice sort of position. So really trying to value the idea of listening to. There's a philosopher called Levinas who talks about the idea of welcoming the other and trying to understand the other. You know, we all have our own positionality, whether or not it's in dominant cultures or non-dominant cultures, and trying to understand, well, you know, as a white man, I have certain powers and privileges that are just there in some ways within a context like this. You know, it's probably part of how I got to the role that I have at the university in some ways. And I would see that other people would have been more disadvantaged. And so part of my role now is to try to at least talk about that, not just assume that it happens and that we don't talk about it. Is to try and acknowledge that's part of the systems that we work with. In mental health, you know, why do black young men get more diagnosis than white young men? It's not. It makes very little sense. So we have to ask some of those questions about the systems that we have are geared up for a particular. Well, they're grown in a particular way, and I think we have to ask some difficult questions as we kind of go. Which then leads to the idea, so as counselling psychologists, we're reflective practitioners, learning about ourselves, the scientist practitioners in the sense that we're using research in terms of the work that we're being informed in terms of our practice. And then we're also scientist practitioner advocates. So in some points in time, we're trying to take on more systemic intervention, engage in more systemic interventions, and challenge some of those sort of practices which maybe are not helpful for everyone. So I think that's the kind of base to the work that we do. In terms of the settings in which we work, this is where that question about what's the difference between clinical and counselling psychology becomes difficult. Because our trainees work in exactly the same settings as clinical psychologists. It's actually illegal under employment law to advertise a clinical psychology role and then exclude counselling psychologists from applying for it, because you have to apply the title of practitioner psychologist. And you have to imply basically competency to do a role. And the competencies and the standards of proficiency for counselling psychology map on so closely to clinical psychology that to say that one can do the role and the other can't do the role is typically wrong. And so lots of the trainees from our programme end up in roles that might have been historically called clinical psychology roles. They're within the health setting, NHS, different inpatient, outpatient, and settings within the National Health Service. They might work in places like academia, educational settings. Lots of people go into private healthcare as well. I think there's a growth of that within the UK. I'm going into the politics of that. Third sector organisations, unfortunately, I think a lot less people go into that. Why do you think people go into the third sector less than maybe the National Health Service? Any hunches?
Less money?
It's a lot less money. So if you were going into a job where you started on maybe 35 grand, or you kind of start a job that maybe you kind of work to 25 grand, even if you like the setting, it's a difficult decision to make. And I think that people often sometimes so I think we find that a lot of our kind of trainings go more into the National Health Service setting because I think realistically it's sort of pays more. And we have people who've gone into forensic settings. So we have a lot of people working with the blue light organisations, supporting police officers, firefighters. I don't know why, but for some reason that's a big growth area within sort of counselling psychology. Some of it was, do you remember Claire Lenny?
Did you?
So Claire, who set the programme up with me, but then left, went to work for the Firefighters Charity, and then she went to work with Lancashire Police, and she started sort of growing this sort of idea that actually most services, lots of those people working in those services are incredibly traumatised through the things that they see. And so now there's a growth of kind of actually trying to support the individuals that are kind of distressed as a consequence of that. And we've had people in Manchester prison, places like that as well. So then, I suppose you get into that question of what is the difference between counselling and clinical psychology. I'll come back to that. It's a really complicated question, but I will answer it in some shape or form as we go. Does anyone have any questions at this point? No. So linked to the kind of different places people work, these are some of the sort of roles that people want to take on. More often than not, I think people start within a sort of more therapist role. So I think most of the people who do the programme that I teach on want to be therapists. You know, they want to sit with people and they want to support people in that particular way. And I would probably say 80% of people go on, and that's the sort of the type of work that they're doing. Some go into lecturing and trainer roles. Some, usually once they've been a therapist for a year or so, end up taking on more leadership roles and managing services, becoming team leaders and clinical supervisors. Outside of that, this is where we kind of get those roles where people might engage in more advocacy, so supporting particular groups or encouraging certain services to be developed. We've got a number of students on our program at the moment who are activists, one sort or the other. So we have people who are within the disability world and sort of trying to support and promote the needs for particular groups within mental health care, I suppose. We've got people who've slowly worked through the system and kind of an ad hoc commissioning teams, researchers, consultants, writers and communicators. And we've had people, I think, go through our program and take on those different roles in all different classes. So again, I think arguably you would see this within a clinical psychology program as well. People would come out and take on so that's where you kind of get into training. So the end product is quite similar to what a clinical psychologist is. You know, we all come under that umbrella of practitioner psychologists, and we can all work within certain particular settings. What was I trying to think? So one of the main differences is how you get that. You know, the training that you go through before. There is one big difference between clinical psychology and counselling psychology training. You'll see a common theme in some of the things I'm saying, but does anyone know what the big difference is off the top of your heads?
So that the fees are waived for the clinical psychology doctorate, whereas you have to pay the counselling psychology.
Yeah. So typically, it's not just waived, you also get a grant. don't know this for a fact.
Bursary?
Bursary. But the same with educational psychology. I think your fees are paid, you also get some money for kind of taking on that work. Whereas in counselling psychology, here, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head what the fees are, but it's about £9,000 if you're a home student, £30,000 if you're an international student per year, 3-year full-time course. It's a lot of money. You're not the only one who has that face. That's the other
Good
thing.
to know.
And that's not all. Because when you take on these sort of roles, you can't work. You know, you're with us 3 days a week, and then you're in a placement 2 days a week. You know, so it's kind of, it's difficult to do. You might have to pay for clinical supervision. You know, every 8 hours of therapy that you have, that you offer, you typically, most of the places we have in Manchester, you get this within your setting, but it could be that you had to pay for every 8 hours of therapy, 1 hour of clinical supervision, which might be, if clinical supervisors can, it might be £30. If they're not, it could be £100. It can kind of vary greatly. I'm using the money bits, but I've just tried to give you a sense of it.
Does a counselling psychologist tend to be not paid as well, like in the end product?
At the end, it's pretty much the same.
Okay.
So most people would go in at band 7 in the NHS. So counselling psychologists would go in at that level and then slowly work their way up. That'd be the same situation as well. So when you get to the end, it's okay. Getting there is a challenge. I don't want to put you off. I realise I'm sort of saying, it's going to be really costly, don't do this thing. It's a nice word. But I think I'm trying to be transparent. And one of the major differences between clinical psychology and counselling psychology is that you pay for one, you don't pay for the other. You know, I don't know what it is now, but I know the clinical psych program here previously probably got about 700 applications, might be more than that. You get about 400. You know, we get about 100, 150. So, and I think that's part of that landscape of kind of, you know, it's different. And what we would expect, again, it'd be quite similar across the UK, quite similar to other applied psychologies. You have to have your graduate basis for chartered status. So if you're doing an undergraduate program, that's what you would kind of be getting for your degree. This links to kind of what you might do if you're taking a year out between your degree and kind of thinking about applying for a program. It's getting some previous counselling training. So what we find our trainees often have is they might have worked with Childline, they might have worked with the Samaritans, they might have done a 1-year part-time certificate course. They would have had some opportunity to practice being in supported roles with pupils. You know, there's Nightline here as well, things like that. So people will engage with that. And I see that as part of an informed consent really to engage with the program. Because it's kind of, you know, you really want to know what it's like to sit with people if they're telling you that they're having difficulties. You know, how you're going to respond to that. If you work at Nightline and you do a shift and for the next few days you're thinking about those people that you worked with, in fact, it might be a certain sense that, you know, this type of work is not for you. It might be a sense that you need better support as well. But you know, I suppose it's kind of trying to ask people to have some experience within those therapeutic roles before they get into the training with us. So this is also linked to this, so the relevant experience in, so usually the certificate, the counsellor training is usually some sort of part-time qualification where you've engaged in the type of activities that we do in the training. So one of the big things we will do is we will ask you to work with each other as threes, one as a therapist, one as a client, and one as an observer. We will video you, and then we will watch you, and we will give you comments about your therapeutic work using cognitive behavioural frame versus sensitive experiential frame. Certificate programs do that, probably maybe not all with a video in, but I guess it's giving you some sense of kind of what the experience of therapy training might be like. and this is the relevant experience, so we ask for the training, relevant experience, and then personal readiness. This is always very difficult to assess. We ask you to write a statement. We also have an interview where we'll ask you questions about kind of why you want to do this work. We'll ask you about how you manage difficulties in your life, just to get a sense of who you are. And then everyone always has a satisfactory criminal records checks sort of side of things, which is always a curious one, because I think having a criminal record doesn't mean you can't be a good therapist. It's kind of, so I think it has to, we have to think about that quite sensitively in some senses. And we've certainly had people on the programme who've had criminal records that we've sort of had to have discussions about, well, should this exclude them from the programme or not? In terms of the process, the recruitment process, so we have an application. We ask for a research proposal here at Manchester because I guess the must-approved nature kind of means that we're quite research intensive. And we ask for some references, usually 2 references, maybe an academic and maybe a professional one to get on the programme. We interview everyone who meets a certain threshold. In that interview, we also ask people to do a presentation and to do a live therapy session, usually with one of our existing trainees, so that we can actually see people sort of engaging in a therapeutic activity. It's one thing being able to say you're a brilliant therapist, it's another in manifesting. Then the training itself, typically they're 3-year full-time doctorates. Manchester, that's all we offer. I think elsewhere, some offer 4-year full-time doctorates and some offer it part-time. So you could do this part-time if you felt like you wanted to do it right now. The syllabus always covers theory, placement activities, research, and personal development. Most of that I don't think is particularly is that unexpected? No. Okay, good. So, and at Manchester, this is the sort of thing we would do. We'd introduce you to humanistic counselling, psychology, theory, and practice. So we'd ask you to sort of learn the person-centered therapeutic approach. Year 2, we'd look at cognitive behavioural therapy. And then also within year 3, we would have to think about, well, how might you integrate these approaches? So lots of services might work in one single model, but we ask you to think more creatively how might that work when you're thinking about the complexity of humans who need to change in databases. And other units that we have in particular are thinking about critical perspectives of distress, which is where we might talk about different diagnoses. But also thinking about alternative explanations as well. Challenging oppression, discrimination, inequality in counselling psychology, so thinking about the nature of power and the kind of systems that people are in that might also partly explain the distress that they're encountering. Formulation is more of a kind of a way of kind of conceptualizing the work that you're doing with an individual, and I suppose the roadmap or the kind of therapeutic plan you might adopt, and then thinking about working in different modalities and lifestyle. So that might mean doing group work, working with relationships or individuals. I think there's another one, group work, individuals. Organisation. Yeah, we don't. No one ever does, but we do talk about organisation. And then lifespan, thinking about different way that you're working with young people. You might need to adapt your work and work with adults. Middle age, that's what I'm going through at the moment. I've got a skateboard over here. I'm going skateboarding after this. I'll put that as my middle age awakening. And then, older adults have their own kind of particular issues. So, I guess that's the sort of pathway that we go through. In terms of placements, so this is where I want to. So our diet is in years 1 and 2, you do 3 days with us at the university, and then you typically kind of go into placements on the other days. usually starting in the second semester. So if you imagine our year ones at the moment are doing a lot of, they almost have to do what we call a fitness to practice assessment before we let them count their therapy hours towards a degree. So essentially it's our checking working with the samples that we put out. Then from the second semester they start to do 450 therapy hours. So this is another difference between a clinical and counselling psychology program, is that clinical programs often prioritise the idea of going around different contexts. So you'll do CAMS, you'll do oral hours, you might do neuro, etc., etc. The counselling psychology model is slightly different. One of the questions we will ask you to start with is, what type of therapist do you want to be? What type of counselling psychologist do you want to be? You know, so it's kind of, well, actually, rather than saying you have to go in these different contexts, is that you could choose throughout the whole time you're on the program just to work with young people and young adults. You know, you might do a CAMS setting, an inpatient setting, and kind of bolt things together like that. Typically, we encourage people to have a bit more diversity. But one of the big differences is that we expect you to do this 450 hours of one-to-one therapy contact time. Whereas within a clinical program, typically I think we would do less actual therapeutic work. You do lots more other work, don't get me wrong, I'm not sort of trying to pick one against the other, but I think that is a big priority within the focus that we have. And then outside of that, you would have all these other expectations. So you would turn up, you might do 3 hours of therapy, but then you've got core training, you've kind of got your paperwork, you've got clinical supervision, you've got you might have to engage in audit activities within the organisation as well. And they don't count for 150 hours, but like as well. And every program expects people to work with at least 2 client groups, so that might be divided by age, so you might work in a CAMS service or an adult service. It might be a particular diagnosis, so we have lots of people working in eating disorder services or psychosis services. And then 2 modalities is where typically we have people working with individuals and groups. But it could be working with relationships and different things as well. So I think that's a huge part of the programme. It's the bit that most people like most. You know, that's the bit where you're kind of being a therapist.
Are these slides going to be online?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
it being recorded?
It is being recorded, so the recording will be on the campus pages for the various psychology programs. And when we have a SharePoint site up and running, it'll be there too.
Thank you.
No worries.
Cool. Probably means I'm supposed to be standing on the microphone. Thank you for participating. So we have placements. What did I put here? So a caveat to the placements is the university isn't a placement provider, so we don't actually provide the placements for you. In the sense, it's the right word, but so I guess because we don't own any of these placements, in a way, so we don't manage the NHS service or the third sector services, etc. They will interview everyone. Everyone will have to apply for the. Go on, ask your question.
Sorry, no, I don't want to interrupt you. I was just wondering, like, does that mean that you have to have the 450 hours by the end of your doctorate, and you technically have to go get that on your own? Is that what you're saying?
Technically, yeah.
So I'm assuming that there's like a program, like not a program, but like I don't know the word, but like the university helps you apply to them, but ultimately it's up to you in your application that gets you those hours.
Yeah, exactly that. In some ways. So we have about 12 students per year. So we probably got about, including a few people who are kind of in the 4th year, probably got about 40 students. We probably have links with about 20, 30 placements that will regularly take at least 1 or 2 trainings. So we don't own them. We can't guarantee that they will take you, but they will typically be supporting the programs.
In that case, can I ask another question?
Mm-hmm.
Do these placements ever Do they ever get paid? Like, are they ever paid placements?
So,
Oh.
no, the answer's not that bad.
Okay.
What we found is when usually, if people are coming into the program with very little therapeutic experience, year 1 and 2, typically they won't get any paid work. Year 3, increasingly, we're noticing that some placements want to almost grab the students and keep them. So they might pay them for the therapeutic work that they're engaged in. So we do have a number of students that are engaged now in a certain setting. Usually get paid on the lower, you don't get band on you don't get employed on the band 6, you get employed on the band 6, not band 7, and then when people graduate, they can drop to band 7. If people have previous therapeutic experience beforehand, some people have actually come and negotiated to have paid placements early on. There's a bit of complexity, but we have a placement coordinator who kind of works with the trainees to sort of try and support people on making sure that we have a vested interest in it getting that work. So if it works for you, then we try to support that process.
Thank you.
And as long as it ticks all our boxes, we know that you're psychologically safe, physically safe within those contexts. If you're getting kind of additional resources like support and supervision, then great, because that sort of lightens the boat as well financially in terms of being paid. Any other questions about placements? We have people all around the sort of region, which is interesting, and it's one of the university talks about its goals being teaching, research, and social responsibility. And I think this program kind of really contributes, kind of both in terms of its research output, which is to this bit, but certainly within the volume of kind of therapeutic work that it offers towards the community. It's huge. Same as the website. The research bit, just to give you a sense of kind of what we ask you to do. So if you were doing a PhD doctorate, you do an 80,000 word thesis. Are you doing, people doing masters, are you doing a 12,000 word thesis? You're doing a masters or are you
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a boost. But you know, most people, when they get to this point, start going, I haven't got enough words. Which you will have in the essence. And part of the programme expectation, we want you to develop a research CV as well, so the university is very good at supporting people to go to conferences. You know, these are all student publications that are open access. Each one of them to be open access costs about £2,500, and the university typically pays for that if it's in certain privileges. So we want you to again get your research out there and support you to do it. I think Manchester, again, I'm not trying to be the salesperson here, but Manchester is incredibly good at supporting postgraduate research students in terms of their studies, whichever program it is. So if you do that, make use of it as much as you can. Then another aspect, reflexivity and personal development. So whilst you're on the program, we'll get to learn about you. We want you to bring yourselves. You know, we don't ask you to role play activities typically. You know, you might kind of, when we do the little therapy activities, we ask you to be you, talk about your life, not to pretend. You can pretend if you want, but it's not necessary. We ask you to do reflexive assignments, so to kind of reflect on what the experience has been like on the program annually. I mean, that shouldn't be an extra bullet point. But the extra bit is, and again, something that's different from the clinical psychology program is that we ask you to have personal therapy whilst you're in the program.
As in, we receive it or we give it?
As you receive it. So, which people, we ask you to sort of during year 1, 10 hours of personal therapy, year 2, 15 hours, and year 3, 15 hours. And part of that experience is about sitting in that chair. You know, what's it like to look on a website and choose a therapist? What's it like to be in that waiting room while you're kind of sitting there thinking, what on earth am I going to talk about this week? You know, because I think that experience is what clients go through. And so we want you to kind of be in that experience, but then also kind of how might you learn through that experience? You know, it's kind of, I think it's a challenging experience because you're kind of confronting yourself, you're looking at your own kind of way of being in some ways. The rub is that you have to pay for it yourself as well. It's a facial expression. So I think, again, in terms of additional costs, you know, in therapy, I don't know if people have ever paid for therapy on their own, but it can range from cheap and cheerful, £25 an hour, to, we have trainees that come out at the end and probably charging hundreds. The likelihood is that for the programme, the main thing that we ask in terms of here is whoever you work with is working with a particular code of ethics behind. So, you know, maybe they're linked to BPS, the British Association of Counselling, Psychotherapy, all these different bodies, etc. We want to make sure that you're not just putting yourself in danger because everyone decides to counsel and set themselves up after a weekend training course on that. But I think our trainees often reflect on that as a really useful experience. Any of that? I'll pause again. Any thoughts about the personal development side of things? Anyone think that's a good thing for an applied psychologist to do, or would really not? We've got a big nod at the back. So again, trying to flag some of the differences, that would be another one of the differences between clinical expectations. Some clinical programs increasingly start encouraging people to have personal therapy as well. Resources. So, we've got 25 people here. Shameless plug. We'll get loads of copies of that one in the library. Laura and I spent, it's weird it's kind of writing fun. I'm trying to put things down, but you know, hopefully that is meant to be quite an introductory text. However, it doesn't exist at the moment, so you might want to look at things like Division of Counselling Psychology. This is the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, so I think they're a big organisation, the big largest counselling and psychotherapy organisation. And whilst they're not counselling psychologists, I think you had a Venn diagram where things overlap. The work of counsellors and psychotherapists is pretty much identical to the work of counselling and psychologists. And United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapists as well. So those links kind of take you to the different websites to give you a little bit of information about kind of what you can today those offer. If you like podcasts, the Counselling Psychologist Learns podcast is a training counselling psychologist. I think she's based in London, who talks about her experience. Might be something to have a listen to. The health warning there is that similar to EdSpsych programs, ClinPsych programs around the country, there are different flavours. So that person's experience would be different from someone in Manchester and but from what I've seen of kind of the content, there are lessons. Some videos, one on Decock, the Division of Counselling Psychology. I did this one in Serious Science in Russia 20 years ago. And I didn't know it was going to appear. And I can't watch it because it's myself, but it's always really weird watching myself talk. But and then it wouldn't be right for me to sort of say that I do all this personal therapy, personal kind of development work on the group. I think you're the biggest resource. You know, whoever you are, whenever you're on these programs, it's always fascinating to kind of get a group of people together and think, well, how are they going to get along or not get along? You know, your history, whether it's your family, your work, your hobbies. The reason why I did the football therapy project was because I used to play football. My midlife crisis activities now taken me to the idea of supporting people in the skateboarding community. There's a lot of people who've taken their own lives in that sort of area, and actually it is a way of kind of accessing groups of people who might not typically access mental health care, which is interesting. And then your experience in life in response to music, literature, art and the world. So, you know, I'll say read my book or whatever. But the likelihood is literature and creative works give you more of an insight into what the human experience is like. You know, you should be reading those things. You should be getting a sense of kind of what, I don't know, how people describe their, I think you mentioned lived experience in particular before. You know, books of literature are often much better at articulating it than me talking about CBT or me talking about such and such a thing. And they're the words that clients will bring you. They won't tell you, I feel dysregulated this morning. They say, I feel fucking awful. And I don't know what's going on. And I just want to feel better. They won't use the language that we use. And then your experience from person therapy experience as well. But at that point, I'm going to stop. Oh, I'm going to give a shameless plug as well to a student. He asked me to sort of say, which will be on the slide, so I'm not going to go into it much, but if any of you have had mental health experiences and are interested in talking to someone about kind of what it's been like maybe engaging with AI and whether or not you would engage with AI, support resources, and he's interested in recruiting people to hear about people's experiences of that world. This is just, you know, it's good. So if anyone wants to, then Chris, who's a lovely student, would love to hear from you. But I'll go back again and just say, any questions? This was an AI generated Q&A. I don't know why it sort of put the things on. Any thoughts, questions?
This is more of a general question, but in what ways is the training from a PhD different to a doctorate? Like, obviously for clinical and counselling, it's more doctorates. Is that because there's more of a focus on like the therapy aspect? In what ways is like the qualification?
Yeah. So in terms of the qualifications, so I guess a PhD would typically be a more research-driven kind of qualification. So I did a PhD in education, and I also did a qualification in counselling psychology, which was a BPS qualification. It's similar to it. It's the equivalent level of a doctorate. With the PhD, I can do any practice or therapeutic work, but I know a lot about qualitative and quantitative methods research, and I'm doing a piece of research with that. Whereas the professional doctorates often sort of gear people up from more that kind of professional. Does that answer that question? And typically, to get into the more clinical world, you have to, as it's working as a therapist, you have to go with professional doctorates. So
Before the doctorate, would you recommend doing a master's? And if so, what kind of master's? I know there's some that are more research heavy and others that are more practice heavy. I think some practice heavy opportunities. Are there any good things like those you should be looking out for?
yeah, we're slightly different in the sense that, so we don't have an expectation that people have a master's when they apply. However, a master's is a very good way of demonstrating that you have research skills and potentially experience within the counselling training and so on. So we increasingly finding people do have some sort of master's when they apply for the program. If you were kind of looking at it, you kind of answered different bits. Because if you had experience in therapy training elsewhere, then maybe it would strengthen your application for kind of doing a research focused one. If you didn't have therapy training, then maybe that would make sense to kind of do one that both ways in some ways. You know, and there are some good masters in counselling, psychotherapy programs around that kind of tick those boxes. But if you've got a master's in counselling, it would be higher level than we would expect in terms of applying for the program. Does that make sense? It's a bit of a word. Is that a question? No. I realised, did I answer? How is it? Let me just go check. So another thing about the clinical and counselling psychology link, I did write a blog about it, so if you kind of follow the link. It links some of those things about counselling psychology pricing the 450 hours, personal therapy, the way you get there, the jobs at the end of the fee, so might be useful to look at. I've never trained as a clinical psychologist, or wanted to train as a clinical psychologist, so it comes from that position. In terms of the gap year, I'm a bit mixed in terms of saying, well, do a therapy training. Now, I think also learn about yourself in the world. I think those type of experiences are really important as well. If someone comes and says that they did some volunteering out in Mongolia or wherever it is, then that could be a really important part of that person learning about themselves in relation to others, so it would be a valuable asset for thinking about the program. Having said that, we also have tick boxes where we have to kind of say we've done the qualification. So potentially unique career pathways, experience opportunities. I suppose I didn't mention how many people get jobs at the end of the program. I think all of our students do get jobs. At the moment, applied psychology positions, there seems to be more than there are people to fit them. And we don't, typically we've had students at the end who maybe apply for a number and then have had to kind of choose which one kind of fits them best. I don't know what's been similar in the insights.
Yeah, it's similar position in educational psychology. More jobs than there are people currently.
Yeah, which is an interesting sort of position to be in. When I trained on the counselling program here, so there was a Masters in Counselling that closed a number of years ago, we'd have 30 students all trained to be a counsellor, and I would say probably 10 of them went on to be a counsellor. Whereas we have 12 students per year, and I think all of them go on some sort of counselling psychology position within kind of probably a few months of graduating, some before they graduate. Hopefully that answers. I think that's all those questions. Any other thoughts?
What's like the average age of a first year student on the doctorate?
That's a good question. I don't know. Like we find people are probably somewhere between 25 and 36. But we've had people who were 60, and we've had someone who's 20. It's quite recent yet, maybe 22. I think that's pretty less spread. Most in the middle, most women. It's quite interesting we have access to international students quite often do the programme as well, so it's quite a diverse group commonly. It depends from year on year on. It's a very different landscape to the twin cell program than when you look at something like that. Anyone wants to know more about the program, we have an open evening in December. Notes on the website when it is. It's not just for the Battling Club. It's all of us Battling Club as a program too, but you get to meet some of the other people that we spend time with as well. But if there are no more questions, well, I think we've got 12 minutes. I don't think we need to do it effectively at this point in time, but we can do that another time. Shall we end? I will linger for a few minutes, and if you want to ask questions individually, feel free. But thank you very much.
Thank you
I
very much.
hope it was interesting.
How expensive it is to become a therapist, become a counsellor. Why is it so expensive? Not that you should answer that, but
We spent many years trying to price that.
yeah. Is it because of like a lack of funding? I don't know if there's a short answer to it. What is it that makes clinical psychologists like unpaid, sorry, paid, but then counselling, even though they do something very similar, very needed, you know?
Yeah, there isn't. And one of the council
We can apply for the same funding. So we could get funding. It's just not guaranteed, like.
not in the program.
Ah, so why haven't you guys applied for funding? Am I not allowed to know that?
Oh, I can say.
Is it? May I know the reason?
Well,
Really?
Also,
A university, like the University of Manchester, of all places, would be hard to want to apply for funding. Why would you?
It's local, you just push
there we
it.
go.
oh yeah.
You have to explain that to me. Why would you?
I don't know. Well, that was the DPS conference. We delivered it in the presentation. Which basically summed up with 38 years of research.
John, one hand.
The bottom line is the very bottom line is the very final slide, which goes to say that actually no longer we got.
And then
If you push it,
Just sharp.
Just push it hard. To the left, yeah.
I understand. No one wants to
Yeah.
take away from anyone,
Yeah, the
anybody's
bottom line
opportunities,
is
but at the
used to
same
be
time, like,
psychology had like an image problem.
like, it doesn't sit right with me that we would have to pay so much money for this kind of qualification. Like, you know what? Paying for the actual degree, fair enough. Fair enough. You know what? Fair. Pay for your fair. But paying for your own therapy and
yes, you can find these sites, but which course are you on?
No, I
I'm sure I'm not the only one with gripes.
this is an also the division of psychology and for the idea that
So you will be able to find
programs to make
Yeah, like I feel like at least, you know, what would be really good is to be at least that 40 hours of personal therapy. Genuinely, if it was funded, I think that I would be way more down to pay for this degree. Literally, even though it's so small, I think it would actually be very encouraging.
the pushes to
Oh, definitely get the fees down for sure. But like I think an appealing factor would definitely be if the 40 hours were paid for, or like provided for by the university, maybe by other trainees, by new trainees. It would be a win-win.
dual roles. It becomes complicated.
I
but,
Yeah, so the bottom line, yeah, the
think
public
that's,
misconceptions.
I don't fully like we before it's not a general misconceptions. If we end up saying psychology
Because it's just paid and because art.
so it would also change what it
I understand. Yeah, you know what? Yeah, it's the other point.
and we do some misconceptions about what psychology is.
Yeah, I can see the problems that would arise if you wanted to make it like paid or semi-paid or something.
But
Yeah, it was really insightful though. Thank you. Because I've been considering the doctorate in clinical psychology for the past 4 years, and only recently did I find out about like the doctorate of counselling psychology and the like masters, and I was like, wait, why have I been told to do clinical my whole life? So this is very informative. So thank you for your time. Very much appreciated. No, it was honestly. Yeah, you definitely did for sure. Like I might not be happy with the fees, but it was actually genuinely very insightful. So much appreciated. Thank you so much. And I don't know your name because I've seen it today. So Terry, lovely to meet you. I'm Daniel. Yes, Daniel. Thank you for your time. You might, maybe you never know. You might find me the next like after I do a master's. You might find me in your course. Thank you. I appreciate it. Have a good evening. Thank you.
I do quite often say to them, so we do a bit on that listening, we will pay. So I can't
Just
say,
check.
you know, show the job description, say, this is what it looks like on a job description. And when you go for a job interview, after having done this exercise, you can say in a job interview, on my degree,
It's really good because
So,
not many people do that.
in terms of
They have to put two and two together. These are the students. They have to backtrack and go, oh, when did they do this? How is that relevant?
I think for
Yeah, that's students in interviews and set interviews saying to me, well, I've don't know why I was employed by this company that did signage, and they said something about that. I must understand perception. What do they mean by that? Saying that's like this, well, you did perception, you need one and two. You understand that people perceive signs.